Hey everyone, Stefan here. I finally did it, you guys. I made a video which is less than 20 minutes long. This one's going to be a speed sculpt, which I don't do much of, so it's good practice for me. So hopefully you can tell this is Paul Atreides, the main character from Dune, as played by Timothée Chalamet in the new movies, and I absolutely love Dune. I've read all the books and the 2021 movie was such a great adaptation. I'm super excited about the new one, I haven't seen it yet, and Timothée Chalamet's portrayal of Paul in particular is awesome. Also, don't worry, there won't be any spoilers in this video. So first things first, I want this to be useful to watch, not just another time-lapse. So let's go into a quick form analysis of this face and find out what makes it so distinct. Looking at a photo of him, especially in the right lighting conditions, first thing that strikes me is, wow, those are some chiseled features, like look how sharp it all is. It looks like he's a little bit leaner in this one than when they were shooting the movie. But this is awesome reference, you can literally read the structure of his skull and facial muscles. Firstly, we obviously have this very sharply defined jawline, as well as the chin, which is also pretty prominent. And this is about as clearly defined as you can get. The next up is the zygomatic bone, or the cheekbone, which is again super clear. And then they have this really clean connection and sharp angle with the zygomatic muscles, which attach over here next to the corners of the mouth. And then from that same point downward, we have the depressor muscles for the corners of the lips. And that completes this nice straight line we have from the zygomatic bone all the way down to the chin. Over here we still get this relatively smooth bulge from the masseter muscle, and I like how the arched border of where it meets the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic muscle kind of complements the sharp corner we get over there at the top between those two. And then this bunching up of the orbicularis muscle and the lip depressor muscle underneath it are also very expressive. This tends to add a little bit more of a sternness to the look of a character. Kinda like when he's scowling, you'd see those bulge out a little bit more. He also has these pretty leveled eyebrows and a bit of a downward slope on the outer edge of his upper eyelids, as well as a relatively short distance between the two. And the combination of these features I think give him a very distinct, kind of calmly confident look. The next important landmark I think is his relatively wide nasal bone, and then just underneath it the upper cartilage is pretty thin, and then the lower cartilage goes wider again. So once again we get these nice sharp transitions between forms. Now it's also important to note the asymmetry in his face, as well as any face. Like here on the crest of the upper lip, and more importantly his eyes in relation to his jawline and chin. And lastly, in his side profile, I'd say it's important to note just how straight his forehead and nose are. And if we were to connect the hairline with the tip of the nose and the chin, how we get this rather prominent wedge shape. Anyway, this was just a relatively quick overview of some of the important landmarks in my opinion. And now let's get into that speed sculpt time lapse, and I'll talk more about my thought process while working on it. Now, I've mentioned before that I don't do much speed sculpting. In fact, it's kind of hard for me not to obsess over doing something as well as I can possibly do it. And this being a speed sculpt, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get anywhere near perfect likeness. So as you probably noticed in the intro of this video, I tried in the end to give this model a little bit more of a stylized look, just to try and get away a little bit from that, this kind of looks like the actor but it's not entirely realistic type of reaction it might receive. And this is part of the reason I don't do this very often. I know that I could do much better if I spent more time on it, but then along the way you always lose that kind of artistic spark of self-expression that it might have, because sometimes it might turn out really well and sometimes it might turn out pretty bad. So instead we try to substitute it with perfection or realism, or as close as we can achieve. That's usually a safe bet if you have the time and skill to achieve it. It could also obviously pay well if you're doing this professionally, but it's kind of overrated because there's not a lot of artistry to it. Honestly, some of my personal favorite work of my own are very rough, quick sketches that nobody's ever seen besides me. So that's one of the things I made this channel for as well. Not just to try and share useful professional knowledge, but also to kind of share in the artistic experience of doing this for the joy of it. My other videos so far have also all been about something which has a special significance to me. And this one's no exception. Like I said, I love Dune, I loved the first movie, and I'm super excited about seeing the second one. And now I know this model doesn't look particularly good quite yet. Like I've said, I haven't been practicing making a head out of a sphere very much, but I know I'll get there, and it's still a fun journey, even though I'm kind of fighting the topology all the time, or rather the lack thereof. So here I'm still trying to get the main forms. On this head I spent a total of about an hour and a half, and then about 2 or 3 hours for the suit and the hair. So I'm still pretty happy with the quality of the end result for this amount of time. But again, as always, I'd love to know what you guys think. So now there's a little bit more detail on this mesh, so I'm trying to define a little bit more of those landmarks I described in the beginning of the video. And the overall proportions still need some corrections, but you can see there's already that prominent jaw and chin and cheekbones, the leveled eyebrows, That bulge from the orbicularis oris muscle next to the lips is probably a bit too large, and the lips themselves are kind of a weird shape right now, but I'll be fixing those as well. For this one, I never really overlaid any photo reference images on top of the model. This was entirely made from reference I was looking at on my other screen. And that entire form analysis you saw in the beginning of the video, I did make it inside my head when I was doing this model, but not at the level of detail I did for recording the video. I really should have, but I kinda just went into it. So around this stage I'm starting to feel a little bit more confident with how this is turning out. Right now would have been a good time to start adding some color to help me get a better likeness, but I just got carried away and kept sculpting for a little bit more. I'd just kind of found my flow at this point, so I didn't want to break it just yet. And it's not like the model doesn't still need a lot of work, and I could still kind of recognize where it needs it for the most part. I'm pretty used to looking at heads with a clay material, but I was at least smart enough to add a mesh for the hair. Of course, it's just a very quick approximation of the hair for this stage. I knew all of these hair clumps were gonna be a pretty big hassle once I got to them, so I was kinda dreading that stage and held it off for probably a bit longer than necessary. But yeah, with this proxy in place, it sure helped a lot in seeing where the head needed improvement. By the way, did you know that the bottom eyelid is a little bit thinner than the top one? Speaking of which, his eyelids needed to be a little bit more recessed underneath the eyebrows. And now I'm finally starting to add some color. For some reason I hadn't noticed how ridiculously thin that neck was before I added it, but after adding that first quick color pass, I took care of it pretty quickly. And again, as usual, I'll be using this color information to help me get a better likeness. I've been using the last few weeks to kind of develop my workflow for sculpting inside Blender. There's certainly some tools and quality of life features that I'm missing from ZBrush, but this is still a pretty good sculpting environment. I've been wondering whether to do a more in-depth video where I compare the two more closely and go over specific features where one software has an advantage over the other. I kinda have a list of those in my mind, so I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know if you'd be interested in seeing me share that. I saw that version 4.2 of Blender is gonna have a new brush manager, and I was very happy to hear that. That's one of the areas where it could really use some improvement, but I gotta see how that's implemented. I haven't tried the alpha yet. Anyway, you've been looking at me chipping away at this model little by little until I get something that I'm happier with. Sometimes I'd be looking at it with the hair or without, or in clay shading or with the color material. And around this stage I was quite happy with what I had for the amount of time I'd put into it. So I decided to leave it for now and move on to start modeling the Stillsuit. And these suits are another great detail about the movies which I really liked. It's designed by Keith Christensen, who by the looks of it did most if not all the awesome costume designs for these movies. So it should go without saying, but huge props to him for his incredible work. I love how he's managed to capture that kind of brutal utilitarian look that just fits the Fremen culture so well, but still also managed to make it sleek and efficient and cool looking. All of those complex interweaving parts look like they serve a purpose. And that's very fitting because in the books, the Fremen made stillsuits are famed for being incredible pieces of equipment that no outsider has ever been able to match. So I just love that they've managed to convey that, to me at least. And as you can see, I'm making all of these pieces with just basic poly modeling. Again, I'm not thinking about making this into like production quality assets, but I also didn't want to just sculpt this out of a single mesh, although really, as you may have probably thought, I should have at least made a quick torso base mesh which really would have served well as a base, and I did end up doing that just now after the fact. So then I just moved all of that low poly topology in place, and all of those tubes and things are just made with curves. Next I added a solidify modifier and subdivided all the pieces a few times, just so I could do that little bit of sculpting for where the pieces lock into each other, and where they did I like to add that little bit of a bulge to show that there's something underneath. I'm using hard ups by the way to add those solidify modifiers so quickly, and then I'm using hard ups again to extract curves out of all the borders, and once they're also assigned the correct color, I think this is starting to look a lot more realistic. After that I just did a little bit more sculpting work to refine it a little bit more. Again, not trying to make this perfect, but as nice looking as I can with the minimal amount of effort. This was already running kinda longer than I initially intended, but I think the extra effort paid off, so it's okay. Now here I am adding those tubes that run along the chest pads, again using hard ups as curve extract and then converting them to geometry so I could sculpt them into place. The hood I just blocked out for the time being, and then I moved on to the face mask. He's gotta have the face mask, you can't have Paul Atreides losing precious moisture out in the desert. I just shaped it out of a sphere and then I used line project to cut out one side of it. And then I wanted to sculpt this straight line that goes down the middle, but I didn't know how to do it in Blender and I didn't want to stop in order to go out and look Turns out it's not a shortcut like in ZBrush, but rather a dedicated brush stroke method. And then for this inside detail, you saw me duplicate the mesh, scale it down, and then just sculpt those lines into it. I did sculpt some wrinkles in the hood, but I left it pretty rough in the end. Next, here's the soft pad part of the face mask. For those little corners, I'm using a custom modified version of the grab brush with sharper fall off. It's extremely useful and I definitely recommend setting up your own. Now I'm finally making the hair clumps using a path curve and then setting it to use a custom object bevel, which is a circle curve which I just adjusted to have a nice hair clump profile. And for each path segment I'm using Alt S to scale it up or down and also Ctrl T to rotate it. And then I just started making a bunch of duplicates. Now normally I wouldn't start with these curvy clumps right at the very front, but instead from the back and move forward. But here I wanted to first test out how well this is going to work for a rather messy hairstyle like this. And I was pretty happy with how this test turned out. So then I proceeded to make another version of this hair clump profile which isn't as curvy, because if all of your hair clumps have this much detail in them, I think it starts to look really bad really fast. So most of them are using this simpler profile, and then only the ones that are really flying out have the more detailed one. And I definitely like the curve controls you get with Blender, infinitely more intuitive than what you have in ZBrush. And also a lot easier to manage in a non-destructive way. And you just saw me duplicate and flip some of the curves on the back. After that I just used Ctrl T again on all the segments to flip the orientation of the profile as well. At this stage it was honestly getting a bit annoying to keep finding ways to route these clumps around so they don't look too messy and also not penetrate into each other. But overall this whole experience wasn't as annoying as I expected. I've made hair like this in ZBrush before, but this is my first time doing it in Blender. And of course I went for the hardest possible hairstyle to try and do. I don't know why I'm like this. Truth is though, this would have been more annoying to do in ZBrush, because while its curves offer a ton of different, awesome, extremely powerful functionality, for this specific type of workflow they're just not as intuitive. So what I did here at the end was just select all the curves and go into edit mode and then switch off overlays so that I could move large parts of it with soft selection turned on. Very nice and again non-destructive. And then finally just painted a little bit of a hairline. And now selecting the whole head and hair and just rotating all of it in object mode. After that I just used the grab brush to move the shoulders roughly into place, and also rotated the eyes a little bit so he's looking knowingly in the distance, if you know what I mean. Then I selected the entire hair again to tweak it the same way as before. It definitely helps if you have a separate collection for it. And then I realized I forgot to make the actual strap for the face mask, so here's that as well. And this was pretty much it. At the very end I did some final tweaks and a little bit of stylization. That was the next time I opened this file before recording the intro to this. So I guess this whole video was just a really long way of me saying that I can't wait to see the new movie. I have a little kid, so it's kind of difficult for me to get around to such things, but I will, pretty soon I hope. So I hope this was still enjoyable and useful to watch. Please like and subscribe, etc. and see you when I come up with the next thing to record.